Daniel chapter 2. Daniel, of course, was taken in this first captivity in 605. So by 586, he's been there, what is that, 19 years, right? He's been there for 19 years already. So if he went in there as, say, a 20-year-old, he's now 39 years old, and he's been there that whole time. And, of course, Daniel has been trained in all the wisdom now. They've trained him. He's one of the ambassadors working for the king. He's in the royal palace. And Daniel is writing his book. And he's writing. The book is written in Hebrew. Now, are you ready for this? Daniel chapter 2, verse 4. This book is written in Hebrew all the way up until this verse. In fact, this verse begins, Daniel chapter 2, verse 4. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic. And at that point when it says, O king, live forever, that is now written in Aramaic all the way through, and it goes all the way through until chapter 3 is in Aramaic. Chapter 4 is Aramaic. Chapter 5, chapter 6, until you come up to chapter 7, verse 28. Chapter 7, verse 28, it says, after all those visions, this is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. Chapter 8, verse 1, in the 3rd year of the king Belshazzar, he's now writing Hebrew again. Very interesting. Now what's even more interesting is when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948, they found 2 copies of Daniel in those scrolls. And in those scrolls, in the book of Daniel, it was written in Hebrew up to chapter 2, verse 4, halfway through. It switches to Aramaic, and it's Aramaic up until this point, and switches back to Hebrew. They check the other scroll exactly the same way. Meaning that is probably the way Daniel recorded it. And what's interesting is those verses right there, guess what they're talking about? A lot of those verses are dealing with the Gentiles. It's written in the Gentile language, so you can understand. Then he switches back to, when he's talking to the Hebrews, back to the Hebrew language. Of course, ours is all in English. But it's just interesting. Aramaic is in there, and it comes from Babylon. Now, when the New Testament comes around, Jesus is speaking Aramaic. Jesus probably spoke Greek, probably spoke Hebrew. We know he spoke Hebrew, and spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was the language. Greek was the language of the world. Because of Alexander's activity, everybody spoke Greek. Aramaic was still the language of Israel. That's what they brought back from Babylon. That's what they continue to speak. You know, guys like Paul, probably Barnabas, they probably spoke Hebrew. Jesus probably spoke Hebrew. He probably spoke 3 languages. And you can see this on the bottom of page 51. These are some things that are still, even as they translate them into Greek. So here's the thing. Again, stay with me now. You see all these problems, not problems, but things that are challenging, is the Old Testament, Hebrew and Aramaic, now translated into English. But then Jesus probably preached in Aramaic. Probably used Hebrew words, could speak Greek, but probably spoke to the people in Aramaic because that was their language. Well, when we translate the Bible, we translate it from the Greek text. So that means Jesus spoke in Aramaic, the writers recorded it in Greek, and now we've translated it into English. That's not a challenge. It's not like, well, then how do we know? But it's just understand there's a lot of things happening in the language. And don't be afraid. God was the one who came up with the concept of Tower of Babel. Okay? So God is well able to handle the translation and getting it back to where he wants, especially when you combine the Spirit with the whole thing. But these are some things that still remain even in your English Bibles many times. At the bottom of page 51, Mark 5:41, he says, little girl, get up. That's in Aramaic. Even in the Greek text, that's an Aramaic term. Mark 7:34, when he says, be open, about the guy's eyes. On the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That's Aramaic. And so the writers, for some reason, they felt they wanted to record something, like they say he's calling on Elijah. So they got Hebrew people listening to him speak Aramaic, trying to translate it while he's on the cross. Even Paul uses Abba and Maranatha, which are Aramaic terms in the epistles. Okay, just kind of so you know, it's all kind of coming together like that. And then, of course, some people would say, again, I can't answer this or have really tell you an opinion. Some people say Matthew wrote his book in Hebrew. The book of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew because it's written to the Hebrew people, or maybe Aramaic. And then we don't have that. They haven't really found this. They just think that maybe is what happened. And then, of course, it was translated in Greek. We know Paul wrote in Greek. Paul wrote his epistles in Greek. I would think Luke wrote in Greek. But nonetheless, page 52, then we talk about the Greek language. on page 331, if you want to just flip your books to page 331. Eventually, you may want to miss these classes, it's coming up here sometime later this year, we'll go through Greek. Tell you a little about the Greek language. Look on page 333, there's all your Greek letters. And I would like to point out on that chart on page 333, the first column on the left, those are your capital letters. And then you're going to have your small letters right beside it. In the early days of writing the ancient Greek manuscripts, the first 200-300 years, they're using those capital letters called uncials. And then they're going to eventually, to make it faster, they're going to reduce those to smaller cursive-like letters, which you see on the right side of that column. And they're going to write the older or more recent manuscripts are going to be written in the smaller letters. And you can see that. If you look on page 334, I've got a little chart there. You can either use that right in your book or you can make a copy of that. And you can practice writing your Greek letters.